Well, after winning Florida and Iowa, U.S. President Donald Trump is engaged in a tight electoral battle with Democrat Joe Biden on the three northern battleground states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, that could prove crucial in determining who wins the Oval Office. Several states allow mailed-in votes to be accepted after Election Day as long as they were postmarked by Tuesday. Democrats typically outperform Republicans in mail voting, while the GOP looks to make up ground in the Election Day turnout. Meanwhile, Biden's campaign said on Wednesday that it has legal teams standing by if Trump follows through with his threat to move court to stop the counting of votes. Trump, accusing the Biden campaign of fraud, claimed he had already won the elections and further counting of votes was like committing a fraud on the American public. Both Trump and Biden have made expected gains in smaller states, and all eyes are on the key battleground states. Trump has won Florida, Texas, Iowa, and Ohio. Biden, on the other hand, has won Arizona. At 7 p.m. IST, Biden had 238 electoral votes against Trump's 213, according to the Associated Press. A candidate needs 270 electoral votes to win the presidency. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the mega US election. Joining me on the program today are Praveen Krishna, Professor, Johns Hopkins University, Preeti Upala, geopolitical expert, and KP Nair, strategic analyst. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Let me get in perspectives from the United States first. First from Washington, D.C., Praveen Krishna, how would you look at the election so far?
Well, it's a very interesting moment. Many had expected that by the time they woke up this morning in the US, that there'd be some kind of a resolution in this election. But for me, for now, there are two main takeaways. One is not so much, meaning given the fact that the vote counts are as close as they are, there are two main takeaways. One, that it's not so much what happened, which is the question many people are asking, but the issue of what has not happened. Which is to say that after 4 years of a fairly controversial, kind of headline-grabbing presidency and a kind of an unusual presidency on the part of Donald Trump, there was an expectation by many that there was an exhaustion with this style of politics and that many voters would turn against Trump. But so far, this is looking fairly close to the 2016 election. So there was a big change that was expected in the way that voters would vote and express their preferences relative to Donald Trump. That has actually not happened so far, which is one big surprise. The second is that many of the pollsters actually, and this year, because of the errors of the polling in 2016, there was a considerably greater effort in kind of trying to get the polling right. Many more entities devoting larger scale resources. And it seems so far that many of the polling predictions, especially in these battleground states, have not quite worked out in the way that the sort of polling agencies had predicted. So we're still here with an uncertain outcome. On the margin, I still think this is going to lead to a Biden victory in the end because of the way that I expect Michigan and Pennsylvania to turn out, Michigan in particular. But I guess we're going to have to wait and see.
Absolutely. We'll have to wait and see because this is politics at the end of the day, and really funny things happen as far as politics is concerned. But from the East Coast, now let's get a perspective in from the West Coast. Preeti Upala joining us from Los Angeles. Preeti, how would you look at things so far? I mean, a couple of aspects that Praveen has brought up about, how anti-incumbency clearly doesn't seem to have been an issue this time around. Very close election.
Well, namaste. Thank you so much, Mr. Pereira, for having me on your show. Wow, what an election it's been. And it is not over yet by any stretch of the imagination. I don't even think we will have a result possibly tomorrow this time. I think this might drag on for a few days. I think there were some analysts that were predicting a contestation, and that might very well be the case. Now, in a case of a contested election, remember, it ends up in the Supreme Court to be decided judicially in a protracted legal case, in which situation President Trump actually will have, he'll be sitting pretty there considering with the latest Supreme Court Associate Justice appointee, now the judges favor 6-3 in his favor. So that's definitely an avenue that I'm sure he would want to pursue if all else fails. It's been a very interesting election, very, very divisive, very much a symbol, I think, of what's going on around the world. I think this election is a manifestation. And I think this is one election that actually affects the whole world at large. And considering the geopolitical situation that's brewing internationally, I think whichever US president does get elected or re-elected in this case, it has enormous bearing on the world, and especially for the Indian-US relations and the Indian-American diaspora as well. I think one interesting point is people are not, I mean, it's coming into the limelight now, but it's the mail-in ballot, controversy and some of the voter fraud cases. There have been several that have been reported. So we will find out, I think, in the next few days what action is taken against that. Possibly, I think the GOP is they're trying to make a case that a lot of these ballots came in after the deadline and that they're not valid or they're not verified to begin with, and that could be a big chunk considering the Democrats outperformed with the mail-in ballots. So I think we shall find out. We can just wait and see.
Absolutely. It's the waiting game for now, and we waited this long, so it's just a matter of probably a few more hours or a couple of days, and then we'll get to know what exactly the situation is. But let me go across to Mr. KP Nair now, someone who's been in the United States for several years and who's closely watched several elections. So, Mr. Nair, several things to understand at this point in time. Firstly, President Trump coming out and claiming victory and then saying no more votes should be counted. Take us through that. And do you also believe that there's going to be a long, protracted legal battle as far as this election is concerned?
First of all, I am not surprised by this outcome. In fact, I was expecting something like this because it was very clear in the run-up to the election, before the election, once the COVID-19 pandemic struck, that there was going to be a high level of early voting and mail-in voting. And the Democrats have been mobilizing their cadre to go in for early voting and mail-in voting. This is, in fact, they have been mobilizing their supporters the way Obama did, in 2008. Grassroots campaign, grassroots raising of funds. So it was well known before the elections that the bulk of the voting will not be in-person voting, that it would be either early or mail-in. And once that became clear, Donald Trump has been saying, he has been shouting from rooftops that postal voting is a fraud. And he has been urging his supporters not to go in for mail voting. So it has also almost been a cause célèbre with him that mail-in voting should be discouraged. So what Donald Trump did today, at the end of the day, actually early morning, it was well past midnight, was true to form, because he said what he has been saying all along, that voting should be, counting should be stopped. So none of this comes as a surprise. The only surprise is how far the predictions of the pollsters have gone wrong. Just as in 2016, they went wrong, in many states. For example, they expected that on the basis of opinion polls that the blue wall will not crumble, blue wall, the northern states on the eastern side, Michigan, etc. And at the end of the day, as counting continues, it appears that the blue wall may prevail, you see. Now, the only problem I see is that, most of the American presidents have had a legal mind. They have been trained in law. And almost all of them have had previous experience in government. Trump is the probably the only president who has never been in government. He has not even been a county councillor before becoming president, you see, and he has no legal education. So today he said that I will go to the Supreme Court, I mean, this is exactly the kind of statement he made during the racial riots, that I will order the governors to do this, I will order the governors to do that, I mean, he still doesn't realize after 4 years in office that the president of the United States has very little powers, I mean, it's a federal structure and the powers are downline, and when he said that he will go to the Supreme Court, it is my assessment that the Supreme Court is not going to accept his plea,
Right.
As we have already seen in the Pennsylvania case, most likely the Supreme Court will say, go to your state, because the American presidential election is not a national election. The elections are conducted by the states. So if he has a problem with Michigan counting, and if he goes to the Supreme Court is very likely toss it back to the Michigan courts,
Right.
So my problem, the problem as I see it, is that he is stretching himself, with
Sure.
claims that are untenable and will not be substantiated when things move on the ground.
Okay. All right. Taking the discussion forward now. So, Praveen Krishna, let's talk about some of the issues really and how much of an impact they've really had on the ground, because we've seen that, the United States was one of the most affected states as far as COVID-19 is concerned. We saw a brief drop in numbers, but the numbers are back up again. So how much of an impact or how much of an issue was the pandemic in the US? Was it something that the voter, was it a line that the voter voted on, or was it more like, local issues?
I have to say that is the one surprise for me as far as issues are concerned in the context of this election, which is that I think there was a kind of clear understanding that Donald Trump's handling of the COVID pandemic was not where it could have been, that there were many areas where he had done less than what he should have done. He was kind of aggressively talking down his own officials, almost fighting against his own public health officials in terms of the directions that the country should take, and so on and so forth. And so I felt personally that the voter would punish, at the polls, the voter would punish the president for having taken such a course. And then because the pandemic is still so live and it's active in everybody's minds and imagination and fears about the future, that there would be a great penalty that Donald Trump would pay for this. However, to my surprise, and I think to the surprise of many, that does not appear to be the case in the elections. The elections are proceeding almost as if this pandemic never took place, or the I would say, relatively bad record of Donald Trump in handling the pandemic, both in terms of the actual strategy and in terms of the public relations of how his office was seen in the context of the pandemic challenge, that he has not paid the penalty so far.
Absolutely. And Preeti Upala, talking about issues, let's talk about another issue. There was a massive movement across the United States that was picked up around the world, Europe, Asia, even India. This issue of Black Lives Matter. We saw a public, spate really between LeBron James, the basketball poster boy, and the President Donald Trump, and that took an ugly turn as well. So how big of an issue was law and order? Do you believe at some level it played on the minds of the voter?
Yes, I do think so, but then it went both ways. What started out as a genuine protest against discrimination, systemic racism, by the way, that exists around the world, it gradually got hijacked, weaponized, politicized along the way. Then it turned into paid protests. Then it turned into looting, arson, and so on and so forth. And the saddest thing is the communities that were hit the most were actually African American small businesses and small business owners. Their stores were the ones that were looted by these paid riots and looting and so on. So I think a lot of different groups kind of took advantage of it. And when you think about groups like Antifa and other such groups, they're I think they're designated as a terrorist organization now, or they're possibly in the process of doing so because of a lot of the public damage, and also physical damage that they've done. So I think there is a flip side to it too. And people, I mean, I live in California, which is extremely democratic, but even here, anytime they were, and we had so many protests here, and some of them were violent, and people didn't like it, the residents didn't like it, and so it's ironic they want to really make social justice such a big point or such a big part of the campaign, or something that they stand for. But then when you see the whole thing unfold in front of you, they don't want to deal with it. So you want to defund the police, but then anything goes wrong, the first thing you want to do is call the same people want to call the police, and then when there's no police around to call, they're all up in arms. So I think it's gone both ways. It's funny that today, at the day of the election, we didn't see any riots and protests. But then there was a point when Biden was sitting pretty. I think he was doing very well. So maybe that explains why there were no riots, because I think we were expecting, if the decision was some kind of a landslide win for Trump, they would have been out there on the streets, and that we would have been talking about that right now. Instead, that didn't happen. That doesn't mean that it won't happen in the next few days or weeks, because this is like groups that have been mobilized, and it's very sad that they're being is so easily hijacked by all sorts of non-state actors and bad faith actors as well, I would say.
Right.
Lawlessness is a big problem, I think, in the US today.
Certainly. Okay. All right. So, Mr. Nair, highly polarized campaign that we saw from both sides, over the last few months. Is this the most polarized campaign that you've seen, or is this the most divided you've seen the United States at this point in time? Like Preeti Upala also is mentioning that, this Black Lives Matter movement, went both ways.
In my recollection, from the time I have covered the last 5 American presidential elections from the United States, and I would think that the 2008 campaign was equally polarizing. I mean, there were initial doubts about the outcome. So in many ways, actually 2004 was also very polarizing, because 2004 actually Ohio saved George W. Bush. So the Republicans were in doubt whether, like his father, George W. Bush, would also be a one-term president. So they really hit low, many times they hit below the belt. In fact, 2004 campaign, the Republican machine, the dirty tricks department virtually destroyed John Kerry's character. Everything that John Kerry did as a patriot, what he did after coming back from Vietnam, everything was discredited, And then I'm afraid John Kerry also played into that game. I remember, to counter this, to give a macho image, he organized this duck shoot, on a boat. He tried to go, and then the Republicans lampooned him, I mean, it's very unfortunate that they tried to destroy the character of a man who has devoted his life to public service, since the time he came back from Vietnam and became an anti-war protester. From the time through his years in the Senate, and then, of course, as Secretary of State, both as a senator in the India caucus and as Secretary of State, we have a lot to say. India has a lot that we have to be grateful for to Senator Kerry.
If I may, Mr. Nair, if I may, that was very personal, and that was at a very personal level. But in 2020, it was at the community level. I was referring to that.
I agree it was at a personal level, but I would say that 2004 campaign also, in a way, was very polarizing because of the Iraq War. Iraq War became such an issue that the society was divided down the middle, and I mean, in his first 4 years as president, the war in Afghanistan, then everything else that followed. So, I mean, as it is, there is this impression of America, the old image, Uncle Sam as a policeman of the world, and that was reinforced by George W. Bush during his presidency. And the society was truly split down the middle, And as a result of that, it became very polarizing. And then there were other issues, you see. For example, privatization of social security. I mean, social security is the essence of your life, I mean, if you're an American, your savings, 401k, social security. And at one point, George W. Bush administration tried to privatize social security. Right. So there were very, very polarizing issues. I think the only reason why this campaign seems worse is because lot of conventions, lot of hallowed American traditions have been violated, Right. Decency in public life this time has been completely destroyed, I mean, I can't imagine the way Donald Trump called his opponent Sleepy Joe, things like that, I can't imagine any previous president ever calling names to your opponent, Right. I mean, it was always respectful. So other campaigns were polarizing, but I think what is different now is that it became very demeaning, very disrespectful. That is what is that.
Absolutely.
I wanted to
yes,
quickly agree with you. I wanted to quickly agree with you, Frank, on that, which is that in comparison with previous elections, where I agree with Mr. Nair, there were many polarizing elections in the past as well. But in this particular election, the individual feelings of anger and hatred and disgust and so forth towards Donald Trump, for example, or the other way around towards Biden, I certainly feel at a kind of a personal level, the intensity of this is stronger than the way that people felt towards candidates in the past. So in that sense, definitely, this feels like a very kind of a much more polarized campaign, much more polarized election where people feel much more intensely about, in terms of how they think about particular candidates. That's for sure.
Absolutely. All right. Very quickly, Preeti Upala, what next?
Yeah, it's never over until the fat lady stops singing. We'll find out. I think in some ways this is a fated, destined, out of otherworldly kind of election. I think the result is actually written in the stars because this election affects the world at large. And I think that whoever does come is somebody who is very interlinked with the destiny of the world moving forward. That's why I keep going back to the geopolitics of our time shaping up. I think it's important that this country gets the right leader, not just for itself, but for its allies and for the world at large.
Absolutely. Mr. Nair, very quickly, your concluding remarks on the program?
Well, I agree with Mr. Praveen Krishna. I think as of now, I think Joe Biden is eventually going to get to 270 and become president. But I would like to make a point that this has happened before. It's not only the 2000 election when there was a dispute about the Electoral College and one candidate reaching the Electoral College. In American history, there have been 3 times when the Electoral College problem was there and no candidate could reach, you see. But those were different times in the 19th century. And on both those occasions, they made deals. Politics was very different in those days. Right. So the 2 candidates made deals, I mean, they made deals in the sense that like in India, before the anti-defection law came, our politicians used to make a lot of deals. Not anymore. It's not possible legally. Sure. So the 2 contending candidates made deals, and it was actually resolved in those 2 cases in the